The Iran deal was, in fact, the worst diplomatic debacle in American history. It did nothing to address the regime's destabilizing activity or its ballistic missile development and proliferation. Worst of all, the deal failed to achieve its fundamental objective, permanently denying Iran for all paths to nuclear weapons. According to the mullahs in Tehran, we are the great Satan, lord of the underworld, master of the raging inferno. So I might imagine they would take me seriously that when I assure them today that if you cross us, our allies or our partners, if you harm our citizens, if you continue to lie, cheat, and deceive, yes, there will indeed be hell to pay. If at any point we determine that the regime is expanding its enrichment activities, the United States stands ready to pursue a panoply of options, whatever may be necessary and appropriate, to ensure the regime bears serious consequences for this action.
Latest news, Iran. Bennett meeting Johnson, Macron in Glasgow after G20 meeting on Iran. Iran nuclear deal partners seeking date for Vienna talks, United European Union says. And Iran hawks, including Mike Pence, gather in D.C. for summit denouncing Ibrahim Raisi. This is the latest news, Iran. Jerusalem Post, headliner. Bennett meeting Johnson, Macron in Glasgow after G20 meeting on Iran, dated October 28, 2021. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is set to meet with 9 world leaders on the sidelines at the United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow next week, including United Nations Prime Minister Boris Johnson and French President Emmanuel Macron, a day after their meeting on Iran negotiations at the G20 summit. The G20 summit will be held on Saturday and Sunday in Rome, and the high-level meeting of the COP26, as the climate conference is called, will be on Monday and Tuesday in Glasgow. There is a meeting on the Iranian nuclear talks planned for the sidelines of the G20, and all parties to the 2015 Iran deal, except for Iran, are going to meet: the U.S., UK, France, Germany, China, and Russia. The meeting comes nearly 5 months after Iran walked away from 2 months of negotiations to return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, as the 2015 deal is known, together with the United States. In recent days, following a meeting with the EU's negotiator Enrique Mora in Brussels, Iranian nuclear negotiator Ali Bagheri Khani said they will be willing to resume talks next month. Iran refused to meet with the E3, France, Germany, and the UK as a group, only separately. The European states would not agree to do that. Bennett and other top Israeli officials have expressed concern that Iran took advantage of the time since it left negotiations in June to advance its nuclear program, and that a return to the JCPOA would be ineffective in constraining it. The meeting with Macron also comes after reports that Israeli cybersecurity company's NSO's Pegasus software was used to hack the French president's phone. The software is marked with authorization for the Defense Ministry, and Defense Minister Benny Gantz was dispatched to France soon after to explain that the government did not know other governments were violating the conditions set for using Pegasus. The other leaders, Bennett planned to meet at the COP26 are Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Bahrain Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Hernandez visited Israel and met Bennett earlier this year when he opened Honduras' embassy to Israel in Jerusalem. Reuters, headliner, Iran, nuclear deal partner seeking date for Vienna talks. EU says, dated October 29, 2021. Iran, a world power seeking to revive a 2015 nuclear deal, trying to agree to a date for the resumption of talks in Vienna as soon as possible, the European Union spokesman said on Friday. And Iran's top negotiator said after talks in Brussels this week, negotiations in Vienna will resume by the end of November. EU spokesman Peter Stano said the meeting in Brussels was useful and helped to define a way forward to resume negotiations in Vienna, in which he said We are working together with other partners, including Iran and other signatories of the Iran nuclear deal, to fix a concrete date as early as possible to reconvene in Vienna. In April, Tehran and six powers started to discuss ways to salvage the 2015 nuclear pact, which 3 years ago, then U.S. President Donald Trump abandoned. Trump then reimposed sanctions on Iran that have devastated its economy by squeezing its oil exports. But the talks have been on hold since the election of Iran's hardline leader, Ibrahim Raisi, in June, who is expected to take a tough approach if the talks resume in Vienna. From the Verve Times headliner, Iran hawks, including Mike Pence, gather in D.C. for a summit denouncing Ibrahim Raisi, dated October 29th, 2021. Members of the hawkish wing of the U.S. foreign policy establishment met on Washington, D.C.'s Hilton Hotel for the Free Iran Summit 2021, a conference hosted by Iranian dissidents where they called for popular revolution against Iran's government. The convention was headlined by former Vice President Mike Pence, but attended by top Iranian hawks in both parties, including former Senator Joe Lieberman and Robert Torricelli, represented the Democratic Party's conservative wing at the event. Speaking at Thursday's event, discussed the actions of Iran's government, including its support for militant groups in the Middle East, while Mr. Pence himself touted the actions of the Trump administration to turn up the pressure on the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and Iranian's Revolutionary Guard, especially the killing of Qasem Soleimani. The Vice President towed a fine line in his prepared remarks, stressing that while the Iranian regime was at its weakest point in decades and should be met with maximum pushback from the Biden administration, any change to Iran's government would come through popular means. He also denounced the newly elected president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, for his role in killing hundreds of Iranian dissidents over the past several decades. Raisi must be removed from office by the people of Iran. He must be prosecuted for crimes against humanity and genocide, Mr. Pence said. His speech drew applause and chants of thank you from the crowd, particularly when discussing the death of Soleimani. Loud cheers and chants also occurred when Mr. Pence mentioned the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iraq, the MEK, dissident organization of Iranians, was primarily relocated to Albania in 2013. One of the biggest lies the ruling regime has sold the world is that there is no alternative to the status quo. But there is an alternative, well-organized, fully prepared, perfectly qualified, and popularly supported alternative called the MEK, said the former vice president. One notable moment during a moderated discussion with the former chief of staff, Mark Short, Mr. Pence discussed the resistance to plans to withdraw the U.S. from the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement, which the Trump administration pulled out of in 2018. The former vice president quipped that it was not an exaggeration to say that nearly every major European ally and other world leaders called the White House urging former President Trump to stay in the deal, which he eventually declined to do so. That comment contrasted sharply with a remark made by the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sherman during a gaggle of reporters on Air Force One just a short time later. Mr. Sherman asserted to journalists that the Biden administration was working in lockstep and singing from the same strong sheet with European allies on the issue of Iran. Events hosted at the National Council of Resistance of Iran have drawn a bipartisan cohort of lawmakers in recent years, while being a stopping point for several top GOP figures, including Mr. Pence, thought to be considering 2024 bids for the White House. The group consistently advocates for an aggressive Iranian stance in line with the Trump administration tactics, including opposition to the 2015 nuclear agreement, as well as support for U.S. and international sanctions. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Senator Ted Cruz have both spoken at the event this year. On Thursday, Mr. Pence left his headline spot at the conference and headed to Virginia's Loudoun County for another campaign-style event on the topic of educational freedom. That is the latest regarding news coming out of Iran. My thoughts and comments. Well, the problem lays in the fact that we have a bunch of diplomats in the White House who think that they're experts on foreign policy. What they're experts on is becoming instigators in dictating foreign policy to the president, the Pentagon, and their influential lobbyists. To have a meeting with top leaders and officials from other countries and not include the country in question is itself a problem. Is having a bunch of friends over without inviting the one friend you're talking about and talk behind his back. This is no different. This time we're talking about human life. And we're probably going to have the American people speak on behalf of the Iranians. Instead, when you have meetings such as what was happening at the Free Iran Summit in 2021, when you have people, notable hawks like Joe Lieberman, Mike Pence, Robert Torricelli, and the MEK supporters, and talking about how Iranians are supporting militants. Well, that's ironic because the militants that are being supported in Syria are from the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and all those countries are against Iran. We can look at the historical record and go through 2011 to 2017, when it was the United States under the CIA covert operation Timber Sycamore, led by the Gulf, supported by none other than Jordanian President King Abdullah II and Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu at the time, given the signatory authorization of then U.S. President Barack Obama about supporting and funding and training Sunni Salafist-led militants to help overthrow the Bashar al-Assad government in Syria, who is a strong ally to none other than Iran. Notice how we're all attacking the Arab world leaders, only Shiites and Shia countries. It's not the Salafist countries, the Salafist supported countries we're at war with, not the countries that supported the attacks of the U.S. Embassy in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, or the Khobar Towers in 1996, or the 2001 terrorist attacks inside the United States, in which we have direct funding from a bank account linked to U.S. Saudi Ambassador Bandar bin Sultan, in which it went through third parties and then into the hands of two hijackers of Flight 77, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hadbi. And I don't need to go through the historical record of supporting Salafist militants. That is strictly from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. It's not from Iran. It's not from Syria. It's not from Libya. It's not from Yemen. In all these countries, we either supported directly or indirectly through funding to our alleged allies in the Gulf. Meanwhile, Israel, who acts like the pertinent sister in the whole relationship here, doesn't have the nerve to use their own military to instigate matters in Iran. No, they use the United States as big brother to try to push the fight further. We have no skin in the game regarding an Iran war. And I think top officials at the Pentagon know this because we didn't beat Afghanistan and we left Iraq in tatters. And we didn't even try to rebuild that country. I think everyone remembers what L. Paul Bremer, the Iraqi Provisional Authority rules, laws number 1 and 2, in which they liquidated the military and law enforcement, which led to the chaos and destruction of the country itself, which gave rise to the Islamic State in Levant. You have former Ba'athist officials who went and trained with the Islamic State to overthrow the Shia government in 2006 of Morsi, which led to a civil war between the Sunni and the Shia. The American people will need to get educated on these subjects because this war is basically right at our doorstep, and it's a war we can't afford. Not right now. especially with the economy tanking and no help from Congress, we're going to need to use the American people to get off their rear end. Stop watching reality TV and sports and start concentrating on the things that matter, because it's your kids that's going to be going to the military to fight against an enemy that we are creating ourselves. They should not be our enemy. Iranians are not our enemy. Never have been. It's our foreign policy lobbyists in the Gulf, in Israel, and in the United States government. They're the ones who are pushing for this, and they're asking you, the American people, to participate. How? By using your kids as fodder. I think it's high time we start speaking up on the matter. The matters that's important to us, the American people.